Fear is one of those things that you want some of, but not too much. If you cycle through central London, as I do on a daily basis, then a healthy dose of fear is essential for getting safely from A to B. Without any fear, I would blithely pedal into a lorry's blind spot. Or I would cross a busy junction without paying close attention to the traffic lights. Without fear, I wouldn't be scanning the pavements ahead of me, trying to anticipate pedestrians suddenly stepping onto the road, or steer clear of those mad line bike cyclists. Fear is a vital human emotion, essential to our ability to survive in a world full of risks and dangers. Something we share, of course, with other mammals and many other animals. The problem, though, is that you can have too much fear. There are those moments when I suddenly become aware of all those risks. This typically happens after I have exposed myself to them, when lying awake at night, for example. It's only then that scenarios of horrible accidents suddenly flash before my mind's eye. Whereas in broad daylight, navigating the traffic at, say, Elephant and Castle just seems normal, pedestrian, like picking up the keys in the morning or putting on the kettle. And let's face it, if those doom scenarios were as life to me in the daytime, in the theatre of action, I would never get back on my bike. Or get on a train for that matter. Or board a plane. I might not even dare step out of my front door. And there are people, of course, who face precisely that challenge for various reasons. I know people who've had cycling accidents and who won't touch a bike ever again. And I completely understand that. It's not wrong or irrational to be fearful. Yet, the fear comes with a significant cost. It can limit or even undermine our ability to get on with our daily business. And then, of course, we might be fearful about things that are much bigger, much more complex than the chances of being knocked off your bike. The kinds of fear that are more likely to keep us awake at night, and probably more often. Fear concerning ourselves, our families, those close to us. Fears about health, work, children, parents, church. And on top of that, we may be spooked by what's going on in the world at large and what might happen next. What if democracy and the rule of law really are beginning to break down in parts of the so-called Western world? If Putin defeats Ukraine, which European country will be next? What if global power is gradually being concentrated in the hands of the fossil fuel producing countries? Planetary breakdown seems to be accelerating as we speak, and yet no one seems to care or be able to do anything about it. Often there are valid and reasonable grounds for our fears. But the human mind is also very fertile. We quickly extrapolate from today's risks to potential future disaster. And on top of that, we are very quick to see connections between the objects of our fear and how they might interact and conspire to create monster scenarios. So, for example, what if the future of humanity consists of a few colonies of the mega rich perhaps safely situated on the moon, shielded from the rest of the human population, which is left to drown, starve, or kill one another for the last drop of drinking water. This may sound extreme, but I doubt I'm alone in being overwhelmed from time to time by doom scenarios like this. I wonder what your fears are. Fears which may be very much alive to you now, or maybe fears simmering in the background. You may want to pause this recording for a moment and ask yourself what these fears are. Perhaps write them down. So, how do we get up in the morning without too much cognitive dissonance? How do we get on with our daily business without being paralyzed by our fears and doom scenarios? Yet also without simply suppressing our fears, just pretending for the next 12 hours that the problems don't exist. Or to put it differently, how in the face of our fears do we keep faith? A lack of fear easily leads to rash, uninhibited action, a failure to navigate the world with the caution that it requires. Too much fear, by contrast, and we're easily paralyzed. We see so much danger, so much that can go wrong, that we are unable to act at all. Faith, on the other hand, could be described as an anchoring point that allows us to act despite the things we fear. Faith doesn't ignore the fear, but offers a position to stand in the midst of our fears, a foothold, as it were, from which we face and act into the future without being stopped in our tracks instantly by whatever we might fear. I'm not talking here only of faith, by the way, in a specifically religious or Christian sense, or at least not exclusively. Faith arguably is something that everyone needs for the business of living. All of us, because of our ability to anticipate the future, including disaster, all of us need faith, simply in order to be able to take the next step. Because we human beings know we are in a world where very little is certain, if anything, and a world where a lot can go wrong. Not only do the most carefully planned endeavors often fail to achieve their purpose, but they can also lead to all sorts of unanticipated results, and indeed adverse knock-on effects. And on top of that, we face the designs of those who want the opposite of what we want, or seem determined to destroy everything we hold dear. In that kind of world, in that context, to have faith is to believe, despite clear signs that suggest the opposite, to believe that the world in which we live and act is not purely chaotic, not entirely self-destructive. It's to believe that this world can and will support some of our purposes and projects, sustaining them to the point of fruition. Not all the time, to be sure, and not always in the way we had hoped or anticipated. But not all our fears will come true. Sometimes we are able to move from A to B, somehow. To have faith, in other words, is to be able to consider ourselves agents in this world, rather than just passive things tossed and turned by the waves and currents of brute forces. To have faith is not to ignore your fears or the waves and currents that threaten you. To have faith is to believe that despite all those, there are still meaningful things for us to do. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Luke 18, verse 8. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus leaves his audience mulling this question. After he's told them that parable of the widow and the unjust judge. On the face of it, there's plenty of reason for the widow in this parable to think that she won't succeed. Plenty of reason to have fear. For a start, she's a widow, which doesn't bode well in the kind of society that Jesus lives in. And this vulnerable widow is up against not just her accuser, a ruthless landlord perhaps, or a creditor, but she's up against a judge, the kind of person who has what she lacks, namely power. What's worse, we're told that this judge has no fear of God and no respect of anyone. In other words, an unjust judge. Plenty of reasons, then, for the widow to have fear. Fear that her pleas will fall on deaf ears, that she will be rebuffed, banned from court, lose everything. Plenty of reasons to give up and just brace for what's coming her way. And yet, she keeps trying, keeps knocking, keeps bothering this man, and she prevails. Why does Jesus give us this story? He does it, Luke says, in order to encourage us, and I quote, to pray always and not to lose heart. We are encouraged not to lose heart, not to be overcome by our fears, not to give in to despair, to have faith. Advent is a time when we are shaken out of complacency, when we are reminded that things won't remain the same, that change is afoot, destabilizing, perhaps even sweeping away the order of things that we are familiar with. In a sense, then, Advent is about our worst fears becoming true. Yet, seen from a different perspective, Advent is about a deeper level of reality, God's reality, breaking through the surface of reality as we know it, including all those shifting patterns, dangers, and uncertainties. It's this deeper reality which Jesus urges us to stand on when he encourages us to be more like the widow in the parable, to find that foothold, a foothold in something from beyond this world, enabling us to keep going amid the dangers surrounding us, to keep pleading, keep working, keep waiting, keep trying again. Not to ignore our fears, but not to be overwhelmed by them either. So, what about our worries then? For example, our worries about the future of this planet. It's easy to lose heart here. What difference do our small acts make, really, in the grand scheme of things, given the forces and vested interests pulling in very different directions? Yet, if this planet, this universe, really is God's, created in, through, and for Christ, then we may have faith that our endeavors, however small and tentative, will somehow fit into God's work of leading His beloved creation to fulfillment. To have faith, then, is to see our fears from an Advent perspective, the perspective of the kingdom breaking in, and to live and act accordingly. Not naively, but trusting that the dangers and uncertainties that we fear, and which so easily paralyze us, but these will not have the final say.